I turned an abandoned mine into my zombie survival shelter. The first body I found was sitting upright against the mine entrance, like he'd simply decided to rest. His hard hat was still on, the lamp cracked but intact, and his fingers were curled around a thermos that had long since gone cold. I almost spoke to him before I noticed his throat was missing. Not torn removed. Something had peeled the flesh away in strips, methodical and patient, and the blood had dried in a bib-shaped stain down his high-visibility vest. I stepped over his legs and entered the darkness anyway, because behind me, the valley was burning. My name is Daniel Voss. I was a geological surveyor for Harmon Mining Corp. Until 6 days ago, when the world decided it was finished pretending to be civilized. I knew about the Ridgeback mine because I'd written the closure report myself 3 years earlier. Unstable in the lower shafts, I'd noted. Structurally sound in the upper galleries. Excellent ventilation through natural fissures. I remembered typing those words in a fluorescent office while drinking bad coffee, never imagining they'd become the most important sentences I'd ever written. The infection reached our region on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the military had pulled back to defensible corridors along the interstate, and everyone between the perimeter and the mountains was considered acceptable loss. I heard that phrase on the emergency broadcast before the station went silent. Acceptable loss. As if geography determined the value of a human life. I didn't come to the mine alone. Rachel Voss, my sister, not my wife, though people always assumed was in the passenger seat of my truck when we left town. She'd been a trauma nurse at County General for 11 years, and she hadn't slept in 4 days when I found her walking along Route 9 with dried blood on her scrubs and a vacant expression I'd never seen on her face. She didn't tell me what happened at the hospital until much later. I didn't push. Behind us in the truck bed, tucked between camping supplies and ammunition boxes, were 2 more survivors. Marcus Chen was a structural engineer I'd worked with on 3 different projects. Quiet, methodical, built like a distance runner. He'd called me when the evacuation orders came, and I told him where I was heading. He showed up at the rendezvous point with a woman I didn't know, Diane Okafor, a high school chemistry teacher who'd been his neighbor for 6 years. She was 43, composed in a way that suggested deep shock rather than genuine calm. And she carried a hunting rifle, like someone who'd learned to shoot exactly 1 week ago. Which, as it turned out, was precisely the case. The mine entrance sat at 7,000 feet, accessible only by a switchback logging road that hadn't been maintained since the operation shut down. I'd taken the truck as far as the washed-out bridge 2 miles below, and we'd hike the rest carrying what we could. The air was thin and cold, and tasted like pine resin and old snow. Inside the entrance tunnel, my flashlight carved a cone of clarity through absolute darkness. The rails were still embedded in the floor, oxidized to a deep orange. Timber supports lined the walls at regular intervals, and I checked each one as we passed, looking for rot, for fracture, for any sign that the mountain wanted to swallow us. "How far in are we going?" Marcus asked. His voice was steady but tight. "Primary gallery is about 400 meters, I said. Opens up into a chamber they used for equipment staging. High ceiling, multiple exits deeper in." "Multiple exits deeper in," Rachel repeated. That's comforting and terrifying in equal measure. She was right. Every exit was also an entrance. Every passage that offered escape also offered approach. The mine wasn't a fortress, it was a network, and networks could be breached from directions you never anticipated. But it was defensible, it was hidden, and it was the only plan I had. We walked deeper. The daylight behind us shrank to a pale coin, then a pinprick, Then nothing at all, and the mountain closed around us like a fist. The staging chamber was exactly as I remembered from my survey, though memory had stripped it of its oppressive scale. The ceiling vaulted 30 feet overhead, natural rock meeting carved stone in an uneven dome. Old equipment sat beneath tarps, a compressor, cable spools, a generator that looked like it belonged in a museum. The air was cool and still, carrying a mineral smell that reminded me of wet concrete. Marcus walked the perimeter with his flashlight, testing walls, checking the structural columns the original miners had left as natural supports. His engineer's eye was doing what mine had done 3 years earlier, but I could see him reaching different conclusions because the context had changed. He wasn't assessing commercial viability. He was assessing survivability. 3 passages out of this room besides the one we came through, he said, returning to where I'd set down my pack. North tunnel, descending. East passage, level but narrow. And what looks like a ventilation shaft in the southwest corner with a ladder. The ventilation shaft connects to the surface through a series of natural fissures, I confirmed. Comes out on the ridge about a quarter mile above the entrance. It's how the mine breathes. Can something climb down it? Diane asked. She was sitting on a cable spool, the rifle across her knees, and her voice carried the particular flatness of someone asking practical questions to avoid feeling anything at all. A person could, with difficulty. It's narrow in sections. But we should assume yes. Rachel was already unpacking medical supplies, organizing them on a flat section of rock with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands knew what to do, even when her mind was elsewhere. Gauze, antiseptic, suture kits, 3 bottles of antibiotics she'd taken from the hospital pharmacy during the final chaotic hours. She arranged them by category without looking up. We need to establish ground rules, I said, before we do anything else. Marcus nodded. Diane looked at me with those careful, measured eyes. Rachel's hands paused briefly, then continued sorting. First, nobody goes anywhere alone. Ever. The mine has structural weaknesses I haven't fully mapped. There are side tunnels I didn't survey because they weren't relevant to the closure report. Some of them may be unstable. Some of them may connect to lower levels that are flooded. And some of them may not be empty, Rachel said quietly. The thought had been circling all of us since we entered. The body at the entrance meant the infection had already touched this place. Whether it had penetrated deeper was a question we couldn't yet answer. Second, we ration everything from the start. Not when supplies get low. From the start. We don't know how long we'll be here. How long will we be here? Diane asked. I don't know. The broadcasts said military operations were ongoing. If they establish a safe zone within reach, we move. Until then, we stay hidden. Hidden underground, Marcus said. In the dark, like animals in a burrow. Like survivors, I corrected. There's no dignity requirement for staying alive. He accepted that with a slight nod, though I could see the resistance in his jaw. Marcus was a man who'd spent his career building things, bridges, buildings, systems designed to last. The idea of retreating into a hole in the ground ran contrary to everything he believed about human capability. But he was also rational enough to recognize that capability meant nothing against an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with. We spent the next 3 hours establishing our base camp in the staging chamber. Sleeping areas against the north wall, supply cache in the southeast corner, medical station near the main entrance tunnel where the air was freshest. Marcus and I rigged a tripwire system using cable from the spools, crude but effective. Anything coming down the main tunnel would hit the wire and send a cascade of loose bolts rattling across the metal equipment housing. It wasn't much, but it was something. That first night, we slept in shifts. Or rather, We lay in darkness in shifts while the others sat awake, listening to the mountain breathe around us and wondering what else might be breathing with it. The first infected we encountered inside the mine appeared on our second morning. Rachel and I were exploring the East Passage narrow, as Marcus had described, but navigable when my flashlight caught movement ahead. Something was crouched against the tunnel wall, and for one absurd moment, I thought it was another dead miner, frozen in some final posture of exhaustion. Then it turned its head. The thing that had been human locked its gaze on my light with an intensity that drove the air from my lungs. Its eyes were clouded, hemorrhagic, the whites replaced by a network of burst vessels that gave them the appearance of raw meat. Its mouth hung open, not slack but ready, jaw muscles twitching in a perpetual chewing motion, as if practicing for something it hadn't yet found. "Back up," I whispered to Rachel. Slowly. She'd already seen it. Her hand found my arm and gripped with a strength that would leave bruises. We took one step backward, then another. The infected rose from its crouch. It was wearing the remains of a mining uniform, same company, same high-visibility vest as the corpse at the entrance. A name patch read, Holloway. It had been in this tunnel for days, maybe since before the mine was abandoned to the crisis. Alone in the dark, waiting for stimulus. We'd given it stimulus. It didn't charge. That was the most terrifying part. The infected I'd seen in town in those final nightmarish hours before we fled had been feral and immediate, driven by proximity and sound into explosive violence. This one watched us retreat with something that resembled patience. It took one step forward for every two of ours, maintaining the gap, studying us with those ruined eyes. "It's not attacking," Rachel breathed. "Not yet." "Why?" I didn't have an answer. We reached the junction where the East Passage met the staging chamber, and I pulled Rachel through, then grabbed the heaviest piece of equipment. I could lift a section of iron rail and wedged it across the passage opening. It wouldn't hold against sustained force, but it was a barrier, a statement of boundary. The infected appeared at the passage mouth and stopped. It looked at the rail. It looked at us. Then it retreated into the darkness of the tunnel and was gone. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to press them against my thighs to make them stop. Rachel leaned against the chamber wall and closed her eyes, and I watched her medical training fight her human fear in real time. The straightening of her spine, the deliberate deepening of her breathing, the way she forced her expression into something approaching neutral before opening her eyes again. "We need to tell the others," she said. "I know. And we need to know how many more are in here with us." Marcus took the news with characteristic stillness. He asked precise questions. Which tunnel? How far in? What was the infected's physical condition? Did it show signs of advanced decomposition or recent turning? Diane's reaction was more visceral. She stood up from where she'd been cataloging our food supplies and walked to the opposite end of the chamber, the rifle suddenly in her hands, as if it had materialized there. "We can't stay here," she said. "If they're already inside." "One," I said. "We saw one, and it didn't attack." "It didn't attack yet." That's a different sentence. She wasn't wrong. But outside was worse. I'd seen what outside looked like. I'd driven through it, walked through it, breathed the smoke of it. Inside this mountain, with stone walls and limited approaches, we had geometry on our side. Out there, we had nothing. "We clear the tunnels," Marcus said. "Systematically. We establish which passages are safe, which are compromised. We seal what we can't clear." It was the engineer speaking, the problem solver, the man who believed every challenge had a structural solution. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe this was simply a matter of mapping, securing, fortifying. But that infected hadn't behaved like the others. And I couldn't stop thinking about why. We spent the next 36 hours clearing the upper levels. Marcus and I moved together, armed with flashlights, the rail section as a crude weapon, and a system of chalk marks on the walls to indicate cleared passages. Rachel stayed in the staging chamber with Diane, organizing our base and monitoring the sealed east passage for any sign of return. The mine was larger than my survey had suggested. Beyond the passages I documented, there were older workings, narrower tunnels carved by hand in the 1890s, when the original silver operation was active. These connected to the modern workings through irregular junctions, some barely wide enough to squeeze through, others opening into chambers I'd never mapped, because they weren't part of Harmon Mining Corp's operational footprint. We found 2 more infected in the north tunnel, deeper than I'd expected. They were together, or at least in proximity, one standing motionless in the center of the passage, the other seated against the wall in a posture almost identical to the corpse at the entrance. Both wore civilian clothing. Both turned toward our light with that same hemorrhagic stare. "They came in from outside," Marcus said, after the outbreak started. "Seeking darkness? Or fleeing something worse?" The thought chilled me. What could be worse than becoming one of them? What instinct drove an infected body to retreat underground, to seek the cold and the quiet and the absolute dark? These 2 didn't approach. They watched, tracked our light with minute head movements, but remained stationary. Marcus and I backed away and marked the tunnel with 3 chalk lines, our code for active threat. Do not enter. "We can't just leave them," Marcus said as we returned to base. "They're between us and the lower water source." He was right. My survey had noted an underground stream accessible through the north tunnel, fed by snowmelt percolating through the mountain. It was the reason I'd chosen this mine's sustainable water without surface exposure. But the infected now sat between us and that critical resource. "We go around," I said, "through the old workings. There should be another route down to the water level." "Should be. I'll find it." That afternoon, while Marcus reinforced our barricade system and Diane stood watch with her rifle aimed at the east passage, Rachel pulled me aside. We stood in the ventilation shaft's alcove, where air from above created a subtle current that smelled of pine and altitude. "I need to tell you something about the hospital," she said. I waited. She'd been carrying this since I found her on Route 9, and I'd known it would come when she was ready. They turned inside the ICU. 3 patients in isolation. We thought they were fighting secondary infections from the fever. They weren't fighting anything. They were becoming. Her voice was clinical, detached, the way nurses speak about trauma to survive it. By the time we realized, the ward was compromised. Security tried to contain it. They failed. "Rachel, I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because of what I observed. The ones who turned in darkness, the ICU was dim. Lights reduced for patient comfort. They behaved differently from the ones who turned in the bright wards. Slower, more observant, less immediately aggressive. The parallel to what we'd seen in the mine was immediate and obvious." "You think the darkness changes them?" "I think the absence of stimulus changes their behavior. In the lit wards, they were overwhelmed by input monitors, alarms, screaming. They became violent instantly. In the dark, without that sensory bombardment, they settled into something else, something watchful. That doesn't make them less dangerous. No, but it might make them predictable." I thought about the infected in the East Passage. the way it had maintained distance, the way it had retreated when we established a barrier. Not because it couldn't breach it, because it chose not to. Predictable was something I could work with. Unpredictable would kill us. On the third day, I found the alternate route to the water. The old workings twisted through the mountain's interior in patterns that reflected a century-old understanding of geology, following veins of ore rather than structural logic. I moved through passages barely 5 feet high, my headlamp revealing tool marks in the stone that spoke of pickaxes and human sweat, and eventually emerged into a natural cavern where water ran in a thin sheet across a sloped rock face, collecting in a basin that some long-dead miner had chipped deeper for convenience. The water was cold and clean and tasted like minerals and time. I filled every container I'd brought and marked the route back with chalk single lines, our code for safe passage. When I returned to the staging chamber, Marcus had completed his fortification assessment. He'd sketched the mine's layout on a flattened cardboard box, combining my survey data with our explorations. And his engineer's precision had transformed scattered observations into something resembling a tactical map. 3 defensible zones, he said, pointing. Primary, this chamber. Secondary, the upper gallery here, accessible through the south passage. Tertiary, the ventilation shaft alcove, which doubles as our emergency exit route to the surface. And the compromised areas. North tunnel beyond the 30-meter mark. East passage entirely. And these sections of old workings that I've marked in red, unsurveyed, potentially unstable, and connecting to the lower levels where we have 0 visibility. 4 confirmed infected. 2 in the north tunnel, 1 in the east passage, and a 4th Marcus had spotted in a junction of the old workings during his solo surveying a decision I'd been furious about. But his discovery made the anger pointless. That was the geometry of our situation. We occupied the center of the mine, surrounded by darkness that contained things that used to be people. Diane had barely spoken since the initial discovery. She sat her watches, maintained the rifle, ate when food was distributed, and contributed competent observations when directly addressed. But the animated chemistry teacher that Marcus described from their years as neighbors had retreated behind something I recognized the particular fortification of a person who has decided that emotional engagement is too expensive. I had 32 students in my AP class, she told me that evening, unprompted, while we shared watch duty at the main tunnel barricade. I don't know what happened to any of them. You couldn't have. I'm not asking for reassurance. I'm telling you why I'm quiet. I'm doing math in my head. 32 students, statistical infection rate, proximity to the initial outbreak zone. I keep running the numbers, and they never come out kind. I didn't offer comfort. She hadn't asked for it, and false comfort would have insulted her intelligence. Instead, I told her about the water source, about Marcus's defensive map, about the structural stability of our position. Practical things, things that acknowledged a future. How long can we stay here? She asked. Food is the constraint. Water is sustainable. Air is sustainable. The ventilation system is natural and reliable. But food runs out in approximately 18 days at current rationing. And then, we forage from the surface, or we find another solution. Another solution. She let the phrase sit between us, freighted with implications she didn't need to articulate. The night passed without incident. The tripwires remained undisturbed. The infected maintained their territories in the compromised passages, and we maintained ours. It was an uneasy partition, not peace, exactly, but an absence of active conflict that allowed exhausted bodies to rest and fractured minds to begin processing. But I knew it couldn't last. Resources flowed one direction in a siege. Time was not our ally, And the infected, whatever behavioral pattern they'd settled into, were not roommates. They were predators in dormancy. And dormancy always ends. On the fourth morning, Rachel found fresh blood at the East Passage barricade. Not on our side, on theirs. Something had happened in the tunnels while we slept, and we hadn't heard a sound. The blood was arterial. Rachel identified it immediately by color and spray pattern. Bright red, oxygenated, distributed in an arc across the tunnel wall beyond our barricade, as if something had been torn open with considerable force. But there was no body, no tissue, just the blood, drying to a dark veneer on the stone, and a drag mark leading deeper into the East Passage darkness. Something killed something, Marcus said, and then moved it. Or something was killed and dragged itself away, Rachel countered. We don't know their physiology. We don't know what injuries they can survive. The implications branched in uncomfortable directions. If the infected were attacking each other, that suggested territorial behavior, which meant our coexistence with them was less stable than we'd assumed. If something else was in the tunnels killing infected, we had an unknown variable that was potentially more dangerous than the known threats. I made the decision to reinforce the East Barricade. Marcus and I spent 2 hours hauling additional equipment from the chamber, the compressor housing, sections of rail, anything heavy and immovable. We built it into something approaching a wall, leaving a gap at the top for visibility and ventilation, but nothing large enough for a body to pass through. While we worked, Diane observed from her position near the supply cache, rifle ready, watching the darkness beyond our light, with an intensity that bordered on compulsive. She'd slept less than any of us. I'd noticed her eyes during shift changes, always open, always tracking. "Diane," I said during a break, "you need to rest." I rest. Lying awake with your hand on a rifle isn't rest. It's what I can manage. Don't police my coping mechanisms, Daniel. Fair enough. We all had our methods. Rachel organized and reorganized medical supplies. Marcus drew and redrew his maps. I narrated observations to myself as if writing survey reports, imposing professional structure on chaos. Diane watched. We all had our fortifications. That afternoon, the infected in the East Passage returned to the barricade. I heard it before I saw it, a soft scraping sound, like fabric against stone. Then Holloway's face appeared in the gap at the top of our wall, those hemorrhagic eyes reflecting my flashlight beam with an almost metallic sheen. It watched me. I watched it. The distance between us was perhaps 18 inches, close enough to smell the chemical sweetness of its breath, close enough to see individual burst capillaries mapping new geographies across its sclera. Its jaw worked in that perpetual chewing motion, but otherwise it was motionless. "What do you want?" I whispered. It blinked, slowly, deliberately, like a cat in sunlight. Then it was gone. Rachel found me afterward, sitting against our supply cache with my hands pressed together to stop their trembling. She didn't ask what happened. She'd heard enough. She sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched through layers of clothing. And we shared the silence of siblings who have long since exhausted the need for words during crisis. "They're changing," she said eventually. "Whatever the infection does to the brain, it's not static. It's progressive." Changing how? When I watched them at the hospital in those first hours, they were essentially mindless. Pure aggression or pure stillness, nothing between. But it's been almost a week now, and that one Holloway, it's developing something. Curiosity, recognition, something. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. It's an observation, and observations are the only currency we have right now. She was right. In the absence of rescue, of communication, of any external information about the state of the world, our only resource was attention, watching, recording, understanding. If the infected were changing, we needed to know how and why, because our survival strategy was built on assumptions about their behavior. If those assumptions were wrong, we were living inside our own grave. The chalk marks on the walls suddenly seemed less like navigation and more like last messages. Day 6 brought our first major crisis. Marcus discovered that the ventilation shaft, our emergency exit, our connection to fresh air, our psychological lifeline to the surface world, showed signs of recent use. Scuff marks on the ladder rungs, fresh scratches in the oxidation on the metal brackets. Someone or something had climbed down from above within the last 48 hours. We gathered around his map, and I watched 4 faces process the same realization. Our position wasn't just surrounded from below. It was accessible from above. "We post a watch on the shaft," I said. 24 hours. "With what resources?" Diane's voice was sharp. "We're already running 4-hour watch rotations on 2 entry points. Adding a third means nobody sleeps more than 2 consecutive hours. Then we seal it and lose our exit route, our air supply." The geometric trap of our situation crystallized. Every measure that increased security decreased livability. Every sealed entrance improved defense while degrading the very conditions that made the mine survivable. We were optimizing ourselves into a coffin. "Compromise," Marcus said. "We rigged the shaft with an alarm system like the main tunnel, and we collapsed the lowest section of the ladder, the bottom 8 feet. Anything coming down has to drop and can't easily climb back up. Anything going up has to be boosted." It was elegant. It preserved the exit while making descent significantly more difficult and audible. We implemented it within hours, Marcus working with a precision that suggested he'd been thinking about this problem since we arrived, waiting for the catalyst to present his solution. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my assigned area, wrapped in a sleeping bag that smelled of storage and dust, and listened to the mine exist around me. The subtle air movement through the ventilation system, the distant, rhythmic drip of water finding its way through a rock, the occasional metallic tick of temperature differentials expanding and contracting the old rail sections. And beneath it all, so faint I wasn't certain I wasn't inventing it, movement. Not in our tunnels, deeper. Below us, in the unmapped lower levels that my survey had declared unstable and sealed. Something was happening in the depths of this mountain that we couldn't see and couldn't reach, and the vibrations of it traveled through stone like whispers through walls. I told no one, not because I was protecting them, but because I wasn't confident enough in my own perception to present it as fact. Sleep deprivation does things to the mind. Stress does things to the senses. And I was a surveyor, not a soldier. My training was in observation and measurement, not in distinguishing genuine threat from anxious projection. But on the 7th morning, Marcus confirmed what I'd suspected. "I felt it too," he said, finding me at the water collection point on my dawn trip. "Vibration through the floor, irregular intervals, organic patterns. Movement. Large-scale movement, multiple sources, below our level." "How far below?" He spread his hands. "Impossible to say. Sound propagation through rock is complex. Could be directly beneath us. Could be hundreds of meters deeper." The lower levels were sealed when Harmon shut down operations. Sealed with what? Timber and concrete caps designed for regulatory compliance, not containment. If something wanted through badly enough. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. We both understood that mining seals were designed to prevent human access for safety reasons. They were not designed to prevent determined passage by anything willing to sustain damage in the attempt. Our fortress had a floor, and floors, unlike walls, couldn't be reinforced from above without drilling equipment we didn't possess. We were living on a membrane of rock and old engineering, and something was stirring beneath it. I looked at Marcus and saw my own fear reflected back, not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the slow, corrosive fear of inevitability. The understanding that our position, which had seemed defensible, was actually a layer in a vertical landscape of threat. We were not at the top. We were in the middle. I called a meeting, all four of us, around Marcus's cardboard map, with every flashlight illuminated because somehow the conversation demanded light. Rachel sat cross-legged, her nurse's posture perfectly straight. Diane held the rifle across her lap, thumb resting on the safety with an ease that hadn't been there a week ago. Marcus stood, pointing at the map with a pencil, explaining what we'd felt. The lower levels were excavated between 1987 and 2019, he said. 3 galleries below us, connected by a central shaft with a cage elevator that hasn't operated in 3 years. The shaft is capped at our level with a reinforced concrete plug. I inspected it this morning. And, Rachel asked. Intact, no visible damage. But the plug is designed to prevent accidental falls, not to bear upward pressure. Its tensile strength in that direction is maybe a third of what it could handle downward. So if something pushes up from below, Diane began, it depends on what and how much. A single infected couldn't breach it, but the vibrations I'm feeling suggest numbers significantly larger than single digits. Silence. The kind that accumulates weight with each passing second. How many infected could be down there? Rachel asked. I answered, because I was the one who'd written the closure report. When Harmon shut down, there were 47 employees on the final roster. Some would have been off-site when the outbreak hit. But the mine operated 24-hour shifts in its final months, skeleton crews, but still. If even half the night shift was underground when things went wrong above. 20 people, Marcus said. Approximately, trapped underground in the dark for over a week. Turning in the dark, Rachel added. Like the ICU patients. Becoming the watchful kind rather than the aggressive kind. The watchful kind still kills, Diane said. It just waits longer before doing it. She was right, and nobody pretended otherwise. We'd been studying Holloway through the East Barricade, its patterns, its apparent behavior cycles, its responses to our light and sound. It was more predictable than the infected we'd seen on the surface, but prediction and safety were not synonyms. A predictable avalanche still buries you. Options, I said. We need options. Marcus offered the first. Reinforce the shaft cap with additional mass. Stack everything heavy we could find directly on top of it, creating a gravity seal that would resist upward pressure. It wasn't elegant engineering, but it was physics. Weight beats force if you have enough of it. Rachel offered the second. Establish a monitoring protocol. Regular checks of the shaft cap for cracks, deformation, or moisture seepage that might indicate breach attempt. Early warning was our greatest asset. Diane offered the third, and it silenced the rest of us for a long moment. We could leave. There it was. The option that had been hovering since day one, gaining weight with each new threat discovered. We could leave the mine, return to the surface, take our chances in the world above, where the infected were faster and more aggressive, but where we at least had room to run. And go where? I asked. Anywhere. Another building, another elevation. Somewhere that isn't a hole in the ground, filling up with things that want to eat us. The surface isn't better, Diane. I drove through it. You saw the smoke. I saw smoke from a distance. I didn't see what you saw. And that was a week ago. Things may have changed. She was right about one thing. Our information about the surface was a week old and degrading in value with each passing day. The military might have advanced. Safe zones might have been established. Or everything might be worse. We had no way to know without exposure. Tomorrow, I said. Marcus and I will make a surface reconnaissance through the ventilation shaft. We'll observe without engaging. Bring back current intelligence. Everyone agreed. It was the only decision that addressed every concern without demanding immediate commitment to any single path. Observe, then decide. The surveyor's creed applied to apocalypse. That night, the vibrations from below intensified. Nobody mentioned it. Everyone heard. The climb up the ventilation shaft took 40 minutes. Marcus boosted me to where the ladder began above the collapsed section, and I ascended through a vertical tunnel barely 3 feet in diameter. Metal rungs cold under my hands, the weight of the mountain pressing psychologically from all sides. The shaft narrowed and widened in intervals that corresponded to different geological layers, limestone, then shale, then a band of quartzite that sparkled in my headlamp like embedded stars. I emerged into morning light so bright it physically hurt. My eyes, adapted to a week of flashlight and darkness cycles, convulsed against the stimulus. I crouched in the shaft exit, a natural crevice on the ridgeline, screened by scrub pine, and waited for vision to return in stages. The valley below was transformed. Not by destruction exactly, though there was evidence of fire and collapse in the distant town. Transformed by emptiness. The roads were vacant. No vehicles moved. No smoke rose from chimneys. The agricultural fields that checkered the valley floor were untended, their ordered rows beginning to blur as nature reclaimed the geometry of human industry. Marcus appeared beside me, breathing hard from the climb. We lay prone in the scrub, sharing binoculars I'd brought from the truck during our initial ascent, and spent an hour cataloging what we could see. The town approximately 4 miles distant showed concentrated damage in the commercial district. Several buildings had burned. Others had been barricaded from outside, which meant someone had sealed infected within, rather than allowing them to roam. The church steeple was missing, and I couldn't determine whether this was structural failure or deliberate demolition. Movement was minimal but present. Through the binoculars, I counted 11 infected in the visible streets, walking slowly, individually, without apparent purpose or direction. Their behavior matched what Rachel had described, watchful rather than frantic, existing in a state of ambient readiness rather than active hunting. No military presence, Marcus said. No. No survivors that I can see. No. No aircraft, no vehicles, no radio signals. He held up the handheld scanner we'd brought. It cycled through frequencies in silence. Nothing on any band. The isolation was absolute. Whatever was happening in the broader world, military operations, government continuity, international response, none of it had reached this valley. We were not in a safe zone because no safe zone existed within our observable range. There, Marcus said, pointing. Northeast, the lumber yard. I shifted the binoculars. The industrial lumber operation sat at the valley's edge. It stacked timber and metal buildings, creating a complex of structures I recognized from supply runs during my surveying days. And parked in its loading area, partially hidden by a stack of pallets, was a vehicle I hadn't expected to see. A military transport, Humvee style, olive drab, with a mounted weapon system on its roof that even at this distance I could identify as a heavy machine gun. It was stationary, doors closed, and I saw no personnel around it. Abandoned, Marcus suggested. Or the crew went inside. Why? Supplies, fuel, or they were overrun. If they were overrun, the vehicle would show damage. He was right. The Humvee looked intact, parked deliberately rather than crashed or abandoned in haste, which meant either its occupants had left voluntarily, entering the lumber yard for reasons we couldn't determine, or they were still inside the complex. Other survivors, potentially armed, trained, and connected to a command structure that might know things we didn't. The possibility sent electricity through my exhausted nervous system. "We can't approach in daylight," I said. "Agreed. But tonight is premature. We observe for 24 hours. See if anyone exits that complex. See if the vehicle moves." Marcus wanted to argue. I could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the binoculars. He wanted action, movement, progress. The mine was wearing on him in ways he hadn't articulated, and the sight of potential allies had ignited something in him that caution couldn't easily suppress. 24 hours, I repeated. Then we decide. We descended back into the mountain. The darkness swallowed us gratefully, like it had been waiting. We didn't get 24 hours. That night, the shaft alarm triggered. The sound was unmistakable, the cascade of bolts and debris we'd rigged to announce anything entering from above. I was awake in an instant, flashlight sweeping toward the ventilation shaft alcove, where the noise still echoed off stone walls in diminishing waves. "Hold position," I said to Rachel, who was already reaching for the medical bag, an instinct, as if injuries were predetermined. I moved toward the shaft with Marcus beside me, both of us armed with improvised weapons and the kind of adrenaline that makes your hands feel like they belong to someone else. What came out of the shaft wasn't infected. It was human, barely. A man in military fatigues, bleeding from a gash across his forehead, dropped from the broken ladder section and hit our floor with a sound that was more collapse than landing. He rolled onto his back and stared up at our flashlight beams with eyes that were wild but clear. Brown iris, white sclera, intact and uninfected. "Don't shoot," he said. "Please, don't shoot." His name was Staff Sergeant Cole Brannon, and he'd been part of a 4-person reconnaissance team operating out of Forward Base Echo, 60 miles east. His team had been tasked with surveying the valley for survivor pockets, which meant we hadn't been forgotten. The military knew people might be here. They were looking. Rachel treated his head wound while he talked, her hands steady and professional, and the rest of us listened with the particular hunger of people who'd been information-starved for 8 days. "Echo is the closest operational base," he said. "About 300 personnel. They've established a perimeter but can't extend it without reinforcement that isn't coming. The infection is nationwide. Every theater is fighting its own containment." "Your team," Marcus said. "Where are the others?" Brannon's expression shifted. Something behind his eyes collapsed inward. "We were 4. We split into pairs to cover more ground. My partner, Corporal Reeves, she was with me when we reached the lumber yard. We found the Humvee there, abandoned from a previous patrol that went dark. While we were inside, they came. The infected. Dozens. From the tree line. We'd been quiet, careful, but something drew them. Maybe the vehicle's battery was still pinging a locator signal. I don't know. Reeves drew them off so I could make the ridge. She told me to run." His voice fractured. I ran. Silence filled the chamber. The particular silence of people who understood that Corporal Reeves had made a choice that didn't require elaboration. Diane looked away. Rachel finished the final suture on Brannon's forehead and sat back on her heels. "Can you contact Echo?" I asked. "Radio's gone, lost it on the descent, but Echo knows our route. When we miss check-in, they'll send a search pattern along our projected path." "When is check-in?" 18 hours ago. So the clock was already running. Somewhere, 60 miles away, a military base was registering his team's silence and initiating protocols. The question was whether those protocols involved a rescue operation or simply an update to a casualty ledger. "Will they come here?" Marcus pressed. "They'll come to the valley, whether they find the mine." He shrugged, wincing as the movement pulled his fresh sutures. "They'd have no reason to look underground." "Then we need to give them a reason," I said. "A signal, something visible from air." "On the ridge," Marcus said immediately. "Where the shaft exits, we can create a marker. That exposes the entrance. Everything's a trade-off." He was right. Everything was. Every survival decision existed in a matrix of competing risks, and choosing meant accepting the consequences of what you didn't choose. Signal the military and reveal our position to surface infected. Stay hidden and miss potential rescue. The calculus of catastrophe never balances cleanly. We signal, I decided, but we reinforce our position first. If bringing attention to the ridge brings attention to the mine, we need to be ready. Brannon looked at each of us ragged, sleep-deprived, living in a hole in the ground, and something like respect settled in his features. "You've survived 8 days underground with hostiles in your perimeter. That's more than most." Most. The word carried a weight he didn't need to explain. Brannon changed our dynamic in ways both practical and psychological. His presence meant outside information confirmation that structure still existed somewhere, that efforts were being made, that we weren't simply forgotten organisms in a sealed experiment. But it also meant a new variable in our careful equilibrium. Another person consuming rations, another personality navigating the pressure of confinement. Another set of needs and impulses that might not align with the group's established patterns. He was a soldier. His instincts defaulted to offensive posture: clear, eliminate, advance. Our survival strategy was built on avoidance and partition. The tension between these philosophies became apparent within hours. "You've got confirmed hostiles at 3 internal positions," he said, studying Marcus's map with professional assessment. "In any tactical doctrine, that's unacceptable. You neutralize threats in your operating perimeter." "Neutralize them how?" Diane asked. "I have a hunting rifle with 31 rounds. You have no weapon at all. They don't respond to threats the way surface infected do." "Everything responds to sufficient force." "Force attracts attention," I said. "The mind amplifies sound. If we engage the ones we can see, we might activate the ones we can't, the ones below us." Brannon paused at that. We'd briefed him on the vibrations, the suspected population in the lower levels, the fragile nature of the shaft cap. His military confidence visibly recalibrated. "How many below?" "Estimated 20, possibly more." "And they haven't breached upward?" "Not yet. We believe the concrete cap is holding, but Marcus assessed it as vulnerable to sustained upward pressure." He went quiet for a long moment, processing. I watched a soldier's worldview adjust to accommodate a situation where the standard playbook had no relevant chapter. "Okay," he said finally. "Defensive posture, I can work with that. But passive defense isn't sustainable. You know that." "We know." "So, what's the exit strategy?" "You are," Rachel said. "Or rather, your base is. If Echo sends a search team and we signal them, extraction becomes possible. If they come, If they can reach us, if they have the capability to extract 5 people from a mountaintop while managing surface threats. He listed the contingencies without pessimism, just factual enumeration. That's a lot of ifs. It's more ifs than we had yesterday, Marcus said. Yesterday we had 0. Brannon conceded the point with a nod. Over the following hours, he proved his value in ways that transcended his military connection. He understood defensive architecture, not the engineering specifics that were Marcus's domain, but the tactical application, where to position an observer for maximum coverage, how to arrange barricades to create kill zones, which angles of approach to prioritize based on threat mobility patterns. Together, he and Marcus redesigned our defensive layout. The staging chamber became a true operations center. Sleeping areas consolidated to the most protected corner. Supply cache relocated for rapid access during emergencies. Observation posts established at each tunnel entrance with clear sight lines and retreat routes. This isn't a mine anymore, Diane observed, watching them work. It's a fire base. It was always a fire base, Brannon said. You just hadn't named it yet. That evening, he taught Diane proper rifle handling stance, breathing, sight picture, trigger discipline. She'd been operating on instinct and basic YouTube tutorials she'd watched in the first days of the outbreak. Under his instruction, her competence transformed from adequate to genuinely capable. The rifle became less a security blanket and more a tool she could deploy with precision. I watched this and felt something shift in our group's identity. We'd been survivors, passive, hiding, enduring. Brannon's presence was catalyzing us into something else. Something with agency. Whether that was salvation or danger depended entirely on whether the world outside was worth engaging with. The vibrations from below continued that night. Stronger now, more persistent. And for the first time, I thought I heard something through the concrete shaft cap, not just vibration, but voice. Distorted, inhuman, but carrying the cadence of intention. They were communicating. On day 10, Holloway broke through the east barricade. Not violently, not in a surge of sudden aggression. Methodically, one piece of debris at a time, removed and set aside with what I can only describe as deliberate disassembly. We discovered it during morning watch rotation, Diane arriving to find the barricade partially deconstructed from the far side, components stacked neatly against the tunnel wall as if someone were cleaning up a workspace. And Holloway standing in the gap, motionless, watching our chamber. Diane didn't fire. Later, she told me she couldn't articulate why. The infected was within range, standing still, presenting a clear target. Every rational factor favored pulling the trigger. But something in its posture, the angle of its head, the position of its hands at its sides, rather than raised in aggression, created a hesitation she couldn't override. She called for the rest of us instead. And so we all stood there. 5 living people facing one infected in a cave, 7,000 feet up a mountain, and nobody moved. Brannon's hand was on Diane's rifle barrel, gently angling it downward. "Don't startle it," he murmured. "It dismantled our wall," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "Piece by piece." "Problem-solving behavior," Rachel breathed. "That's not possible. The infection destroys higher cognitive function." "Apparently not completely," I said. Holloway's eyes tracked between us individual recognition, each face cataloged in whatever remained of its neural architecture. When its gaze reached Brannon, something changed. The jaw-working motion intensified. Its weight shifted forward slightly, not a step, but an intention. It recognized him as new, as different. Easy, Brannon said. To the infected. To us. To himself. Long seconds passed. My heartbeat counted them each one a discrete unit of suspended causality. Then Holloway turned, walked back into the East Passage, and disappeared into darkness. The exhalation from 5 sets of lungs was almost loud enough to echo. "What the hell was that?" Diane demanded, her composure shattering into justified alarm. "Reconnaissance," Brannon said. His face was professionally neutral, but I could see sweat on his temples. It was looking at us, assessing. Assessing for what? Nobody answered, because every possible answer was terrifying. Assessing our numbers, assessing our defenses, assessing our capability, all of these presumed cognitive function that the infection wasn't supposed to preserve. All of these implied planning. "We rebuild the barricade stronger," Marcus said. "Weld it if we can manage it. The compressor might have torch attachments." "Will that matter?" Rachel asked. "It took apart the last one. Given time, it'll take apart anything we build." "Then we don't give it time. We seal the East Passage permanently, collapse it." "That changes the airflow dynamics," I said. "The East Passage contributes to ventilation circulation. Seal it, and we reduce our air refresh by approximately 30%. Every solution spawned new problems. Every defensive measure degraded our living conditions. The mine was teaching us a lesson about fortification that history already knew. Castles fall not to assault, but to siege. Not to the enemy's strength, but to the defender's gradual deterioration." "We're being studied," Rachel said quietly. "That's what's happening. They're in the dark, and they're watching us, and they're learning." "Learning what?" "How we work, how we respond, where our boundaries are." She met my eyes across the chamber. "The hospital infected in the ICU. The ones who turned in darkness, they eventually coordinated. Not immediately, not obviously. But over days, they began moving together, responding to each other's vocalizations, acting in concert." "You didn't mention that before." "I wasn't sure it was relevant before. I thought we were dealing with isolated individuals. But if they're communicating, if the ones above are communicating with the ones below..." She didn't finish. The vibrations from the lower levels chose that moment to pulse through the floor, strong enough that I felt them through my boots. And for the first time, they carried a rhythm, a pattern, repeated, deliberate, answering. The group fractured on day 11. Not dramatically, there was no screaming match, no violent disagreement, no single moment I can point to and say, that's where we broke. It was more geological than that. Pressure applied over time, finding the natural weaknesses in our cohesion and exploiting them with the patience of water through limestone. Brannon wanted to fight our way to the surface. He'd been underground for 3 days, and the confinement was eroding his training at an accelerating rate. "Every hour we stay is an hour Echo's search window shrinks," he argued. "Every hour is an hour that they get smarter down there. The balance is shifting against us." Diane aligned with him, not from military reasoning, but from exhaustion, the particular depletion that comes from perpetual threat awareness. "I can't keep watching the dark," she said. "I can't keep waiting for them to decide the experiment is over and it's time to breach." Marcus stood between positions. His engineering mind saw the merit in both staying and leaving, the structural advantages of our position versus the deteriorating integrity of our perimeter. He was running calculations he wouldn't share, and his silence was louder than anyone's arguments. Rachel and I argued for patience. 2 more days, I said. Give Echo time to reach the valley. Signal from the ridge. Wait for response before committing to surface travel that might kill us in the first kilometer. 2 days might be 2 days too many, Brannon said. You haven't been on the surface. You don't know how fast those things can mobilize when they decide to move. And you haven't been down here for 10 days, I shot back. You don't know the patterns we've observed. You don't know what these specific infected do and don't do. They took apart your wall, Daniel, piece by piece. That's not a pattern I want to bet my life on. He wasn't wrong. None of us were wrong. That was the cruelty of it. Every position was rational, defensible, supported by evidence. We weren't arguing about facts. We were arguing about which fear to prioritize. The compromise we reached was fragile. Brannon and I would ascend to the ridge the following morning. If we saw any sign of Echo's search operation aircraft, vehicles, signal flares, we'd commit to signaling and waiting. If we saw nothing, we'd begin planning surface extraction as a group. Diane agreed reluctantly. Marcus nodded once. Rachel said nothing, which told me everything about her assessment of our odds. That night was the longest. Not because anything happened, the infected remained in their territories. The vibrations continued their pattern but didn't intensify. The shaft cap held, but because the psychological weight of approaching a decision point compressed time into something viscous and resistant. I lay in darkness and listened to 4 other people not sleeping. The sounds of wakefulness are distinct from sleep. The frequency of positional shifts, the depth of breathing, the occasional swallow that betrays conscious thought. 5 minds running parallel calculations in the dark, each arriving at conclusions they wouldn't voice until morning. Around 3 a.m. by my watch, I heard Rachel move. Soft footsteps approaching my position, then her weight settling beside me. She didn't speak immediately. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she finally said, her voice barely more than breath, "I need you to know that coming here was the right call. We're alive because of this mine. 10 days is 10 days more than most people got." "Rachel, don't. I'm not being fatalistic. I'm being grateful. There's a difference." She returned to her position. I stared at the invisible ceiling above me and thought about the word most. Most people. Most didn't survive. Most were running or hiding or already gone. We were alive in a hole in the ground, surrounded by things that were learning to think, and that still qualified as success. The bar had moved so far. I closed my eyes and didn't sleep and waited for a dawn I wouldn't see from here. Morning arrived by watch rather than light. Brannon and I prepared for the ascent in silence, water, binoculars, the handheld radio scanner, and Diane's rifle on loan. Rachel checked his sutures one final time, pronouncing them healing clean. Marcus gave me a folded piece of paper, his complete map of the mine, annotated with every observation we'd made, every chalk mark, every assessed threat. "In case," he said. "In case of what?" "In case you need to direct someone here. In case Echo comes and needs to know what they're walking into." I took the map and put it in my jacket pocket, and the weight of it felt like more than paper. The climb was faster than before, familiarity with the shaft's rhythm, hands knowing which rungs to trust and which to skip. We emerged into a morning that was overcast and cold. Low clouds sitting on the ridgeline like a gray ceiling that compressed the visible world into a narrow band of valley and tree. We took positions and waited. Binoculars sweeping methodically across every compass point, the radio scanner cycling its frequencies in patient repetition. 1 hour passed, then 2. Nothing. No aircraft, no vehicles, no signal flares, no radio traffic on any band. "It's been over 48 hours since you missed check-in," I said. "Would they have sent someone by now?" Brannon's jaw worked. "Protocol says yes. Reality might say different. If Echo's dealing with its own situation, if the perimeter was pressured, if resources were redirected, our extraction drops in priority. Below what? Below base survival. He lowered the binoculars. I have to consider the possibility that Echo isn't coming, that we're operational for ourselves. The words hung between us like a severance. Not from the military, from hope. The particular hope that someone else would solve this. That rescue would arrive and decisions would pass to more capable hands. That hope, which had been gossamer thin since the beginning, dissolved entirely in the gray morning air. Then we leave the mine, I said. On foot, armed with one rifle and improvised weapons. 5 people, 3 of whom have no tactical training. Yes. Through terrain that contains an unknown number of infected, some of whom are exhibiting intelligence we can't predict. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've seen worse odds. Have you? No, but it seemed like the thing to say. An unexpected laugh escaped me, brief, almost painful, the first in days. Brannon's mouth quirked in response. Then his expression sharpened, focused on something in the valley below that I'd missed. There, he said. West Ridge, moving uphill. I found it through binoculars. A figure climbing the western face of the ridge opposite ours, moving with a pace that was too purposeful for infected, too fast for casual travel. It carried something on its back, a pack, military style, and moved with the fluid efficiency of someone trained in terrain navigation. Reeves, I breathed. Brannon's entire body had gone rigid. It could be. The build is right. The movement pattern. He grabbed the binoculars from me, adjusted focus with shaking fingers. I can't confirm. Too far. But the gear is right. She drew them off. You said she told you to run. People survive things, he said. Corporal Reeves survives things. That's what she does. The figure crested the western ridge and disappeared over the far side, moving away from us, unaware of our observation. If it was Reeves, if she'd survived, if she was searching for Brannon, if she was heading somewhere, she was heading in the wrong direction. We need to make contact, Brannon said. His voice had transformed the fatalism of moments ago, replaced by something fierce and immediate. If that's her, she has a radio. She has extraction protocols. She's our link to Echo. She's also 2 ridges away and moving away from us. Then we move fast. The decision was being made by momentum now, by the sight of potential salvation, walking away. I looked down at the mine entrance hidden in the rocks below us and thought of 3 people underground, waiting for intelligence that would determine their fate. We go back first, I said. We get the others. We go together. The descent back into the mine carried urgency that made the shaft feel twice as long. We hit the bottom, and I was already calling out, announcing our return, what we'd seen, what it meant. 3 faces met us with the particular expression of people who've been waiting for a verdict. I told them quickly. No sign of Echo, but a potential survivor on the West Ridge, possibly Brannon's team member, possibly carrying communication equipment that could change everything. The window was closing. She was moving away. And every minute of deliberation was distance between us and rescue. How far? Marcus asked. 2 ridges, maybe 4 miles in a straight line, significantly more on terrain. Half a day's hard travel. Through what? Through outside, Diane said. Her voice carried something new, not reluctance, but a strange relief. The decision had been made for them by circumstance. The debate about staying versus leaving was now academic. They were leaving. We packed in 30 minutes. Everything we could carry: water, the remaining food, medical supplies, weapons. Marcus rolled his cardboard map carefully and slid it into a tube made from a metal pipe. Rachel distributed medical essentials into every pack so that no single loss would be catastrophic. Brannon checked Diane's rifle, satisfied himself with its condition, and fashioned a shoulder sling from cable. The staging chamber, which had been our world for 10 days, looked diminished without our presence filling it. Just a cave again. Cold equipment under tarps, chalk marks on walls that would mean nothing to anyone who came after. I took one last look and felt nothing I expected. Not nostalgia, not gratitude, just the neutral recognition of a chapter ending. We ascended the shaft in sequence, Marcus first, then Rachel, then Diane, then me, with Brannon last to ensure no one fell. The collapsed ladder section required a boost system we'd developed. Rope looped over a protruding bolt above, body weight hauled upward by combined effort below. It was slow and exhausting, and every second of vulnerability in the shaft pressed against my consciousness. But we made it. All 5, emerging onto the ridge into gray afternoon light, breathing surface air that tasted impossibly rich after days of mineral underground atmosphere. Rachel's face transformed and the daylight color returning to skin that had gone paper pale, eyes widening as if seeing the sky for the first time. "Don't stand," Brannon instructed. "Stay low. Move to the tree line before going upright." We crawled through scrub pine and loose rock, reaching the cover of trees before rising to full height. The forest wrapped around us, towering pines, undergrowth thick enough to screen movement, a carpet of needles that muffled footsteps. After the mine's hard surfaces, the organic world felt almost impossibly textured. Brannon oriented us, west toward the ridge where we'd seen the figure. The terrain between was forested mountainsides, steep in places, traversed by game trails that followed the path of least resistance along the contours. He took point, Diane behind him with the rifle, then Rachel, then me, then Marcus at rear guard. We moved in silence, communicating with hand signals Brannon taught in a 60-second briefing. Stop, move, down, threat left, threat right, regroup. The vocabulary of tactical movement stripped to essentials. I felt simultaneously grateful for his expertise and terrified by how naturally it felt to be moving like prey through a landscape that had once been home. 20 minutes in, Brannon raised his fist. We stopped. He was crouched at the edge of a small clearing, and when I moved up beside him, I saw what had halted our progress. A group of infected. 7 of them, standing in the clearing in a loose circle, facing inward, not moving, not responding to our presence 20 meters away in the trees, standing in formation, heads slightly bowed, as if in some grotesque parody of conference. They were still. They were silent. And they were between us and the western ridge. Brannon's eyes met mine. The question in them was clear. Around or through? We went around. Brannon led us in a wide arc, adding 40 minutes to our travel time but maintaining distance from the clearing. I kept watching through gaps in the trees as we moved. The 7 infected remained in their formation, motionless, their purpose indeterminate. Rachel was watching too, and I could see her medical mind cataloging observations she'd analyze later if we had a later. The terrain steepened as we approached the first ridge between us and our target. Marcus began to struggle, not from lack of fitness, but from the accumulated deficit of 10 days underground with inadequate nutrition and disrupted sleep. His breathing became audible, and twice he stumbled on root systems that the rest of us navigated cleanly. "We can rest," I told him. "No." He straightened, pulled air deep into his lungs, and pushed forward. The stubbornness of a man who refuses to be the weak link. I respected it, while noting it as a potential liability. Stubbornness without reserve becomes collapse without warning. We crested the first ridge and descended into the valley between, where a stream cut through the forest floor in a channel of smooth stones and clear water. Brannon called a 5-minute stop. Hydrate, check feet, eyes up. And we knelt at the stream's edge, filling bottles and drinking directly from the flow. It was during this pause that Diane spoke the first full sentences she'd offered since we left the mine. They were communicating, the ones in the clearing. I've seen group behavior in animals, flocking, murmuration, coordinated hunting patterns. That had the quality of information exchange. "You can't know that," Brannon said. "I'm a science teacher. I observe. And I'm telling you those 7 individuals were oriented toward a center point, maintaining equidistant spacing, exhibiting synchronized respiratory patterns. That's not random aggregation. That's organized assembly." Brannon didn't respond, but I saw him absorb the information with the seriousness of a man reassessing his enemy's capabilities in real time. We crossed the stream and began ascending the second ridge. The gradient was severe, 40 degrees in places, forcing us to use hands and find footholds among exposed roots and rocky outcrops. Halfway up, Marcus's reserves finally failed. He sat heavily against a boulder, chest heaving, face gray. 5 minutes, he gasped. "Just 5. Rachel was beside him instantly, fingers on his wrist, counting pulse with the efficiency of long practice. "Elevated but not dangerous," she reported. "He needs calories." I opened my pack and found the last energy bar, a compressed rectangle of oats and sugar that represented maybe 300 calories of deferred collapse. Marcus ate it in 3 bites, chewing mechanically, and I watched color return to his face by degrees. We waited 8 minutes. Brannon watched the forest below us with rigid attention. And twice I thought I saw movement among the trees, shadow shapes that might have been infected, or might have been the paranoid projections of an exhausted mind. The distinction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Then we pushed. The final section of the ridge was sheer enough that Brannon anchored himself at the top and pulled each of us over the crest individually, using a length of rope from his pack that appeared with the casual magic of military preparedness. From the top of the second ridge, the western face spread below us the slope where we'd seen the figure climbing that morning. If she'd continued in the direction of travel we'd observed, she'd be beyond the next drainage by now. Hours ahead of us, increasing the gap with every minute. "We'll never catch her on foot," I said. "We don't have to catch her," Brannon said. "We have to signal her." He was right. If it was Reeves, if she had military training and awareness, she'd recognize a signal. She'd interpret it. She'd respond. "We need fire," he said, visible from distance, distinct from natural occurrence. A pattern she'd recognize. Fire attracts everything. Yes, everything includes her. The gamble sat before us like a door. Signal and attract both rescue and threat, or stay silent and watch our only hope walk beyond reach. The final section of the ridge was sheer enough that Brannon anchored himself at the top and pulled each of us over the crest individually, using a length of rope from his pack that appeared with the casual magic of military preparedness. From the top of the second ridge, the western face spread below us the slope where we'd seen the figure climbing that morning. If she'd continued in the direction of travel we'd observed, she'd be beyond the next drainage by now. Hours ahead of us, increasing the gap with every minute. "We'll never catch her on foot," I said. "We don't have to catch her," Brannon said. "We have to signal her." He was right. If it was Reeves, if she had military training and awareness, she'd recognize a signal. She'd interpret it. She'd respond. "We need fire," he said, visible from distance, distinct from natural occurrence. A pattern she'd recognize. Fire attracts everything. Yes, everything includes her. The gamble sat before us like a door. Signal and attract both rescue and threat. Or stay silent and watch our only hope walk beyond reach. There was no third option. There never had been. We built the signal fire at the ridge's highest point. A rocky prominence clear of tree cover, where smoke would rise unobstructed against the gray sky. Brannon specified the pattern. 3 fires in a line, the universal distress. There was no third option. There never had been. We built the signal fire at the ridge's highest point. Signal, each fed with green pine boughs that produced thick white smoke visible for miles. Marcus and Rachel gathered materials while Diane and Brannon maintained watch. I worked the fires. My survey fieldwork had included enough wilderness time that fire-making was muscle memory. Within 20 minutes, 3 columns of smoke rose from our position like proclamations written on the sky. It was sheer enough that Brannon anchored himself at the top and pulled each of us over the crest individually, using a length of rope from his pack that appeared with the casual magic of military preparedness. From the top of the second ridge, the western face spread below us the slope where we'd seen the figure climbing that morning. If she'd continued in the direction of travel we'd observed, she'd be beyond the next drainage by now. Hours ahead of us, increasing the gap with every minute. "We'll never catch her on foot," I said. "We don't have to catch her," Brannon said. "We have to signal her." He was right. If it was Reeves, if she had military training and awareness, she'd recognize a signal. She'd interpret it. She'd respond. "We need fire," he said, visible from distance, distinct from natural occurrence. A pattern she'd recognize. Fire attracts everything. Yes, everything includes her. The gamble sat before us like a door. Signal and attract both rescue and threat. Or stay silent and watch our only hope walk beyond reach. There was no third option. There never had been. We built the signal fire at the ridge's highest point. A rocky prominence clear of tree cover, where smoke would rise unobstructed against the gray sky. Brannon specified the pattern. 3 fires in a line, the universal distress signal, each fed with green pine boughs that produced thick white smoke visible for miles. Marcus and Rachel gathered materials while Diane and Brannon maintained watch. I worked the fires. My survey fieldwork had included enough wilderness time that fire-making was muscle memory. Within 20 minutes, 3 columns of smoke rose from our position like proclamations written on the sky. "Now we wait," Brannon said, "and we prepare for what that brings." What it brought came faster than any of us expected. The infected emerged from the tree line below, within 10 minutes, drawn by the smoke, by the activity, by whatever stimulus told their altered neurology that something alive was operating above them. I counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting because the number was... "Now we wait," Brannon said, "and we prepare for what that brings." What it brought came faster than any of us expected. The infected emerged from the tree line below, within 10 minutes, drawn by the smoke, by the activity, by whatever stimulus told their altered neurology that something alive was operating above them. I counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting because the number was academic. They moved uphill toward us with that measured pace we'd observed, not charging, but advancing. Purposeful without urgency, patient without hesitation. "We need to hold this position until she sees the signal," Brannon said. "If she's within visual range, she'll come. And if she's not, there's academic." They moved uphill toward us with that measured pace we'd observed, not charging, but advancing. purposeful without urgency, patient without hesitation. We need to hold this position until she sees the signal, Brannon said. If she's within visual range, she'll come. And if she's not? Then this was a bad idea, and we improvise. Diane was prone behind a rock outcropping, rifle shouldered, eye to scope. I have clear shots at the first 3, she reported. Do I engage? Not until they reach the 50-meter line, Brannon said. Conserve ammunition. The infected climbed. Their movement was coordinated in ways that made Diane's earlier observation unavoidable, and this was a bad idea, and we improvise. Diane was prone behind a rock outcropping. They didn't bunch or scatter. They maintained spacing. They used terrain features for easier ascent. They exhibited spatial awareness that the first day's infected had entirely lacked. Rachel was beside me, watching their approach with clinical fascination that barely masked her terror. They're adapting, she said, learning from the environment, using what's available. Rachel, this isn't the time for observation notes. It's always the time, hesitation. We need to hold this position until she sees the signal, Brannon said. If she's within visual range, she'll come. And if she's not? Then this was a bad idea, and we improvise. Diane was prone behind a rock outcropping, rifle shouldered, eye to scope. I have clear shots at the first 3, she reported. Do I engage? Not until they reach the 50-meter line, Brannon said. Conserve ammunition. The infected climbed. Their movement was coordinated in ways that made Diane's earlier observation unavoidable. They didn't bunch or scatter. They maintained spacing. They used terrain features for easier ascent. They exhibited spatial awareness that the first day's infected had entirely lacked. Rachel was beside me, watching their approach with clinical fascination that barely masked her terror. They're adapting, she said, learning from the environment, using what's available. Rachel, this isn't the time for observation notes. It's always the time. Understanding them is the only advantage we might have. The first infected reached 50 meters. Diane fired. The report crashed across the mountain like a physical force, and the bullet found its marked center mass, dropping the infected instantly. It fell and didn't. Understanding them is the only advantage we might have. The first infected reached 50 meters. Diane fired. The report crashed across the mountain like a physical force, and the bullet found its marked center mass, dropping the infected instantly. It fell and didn't rise. The others didn't scatter, didn't flinch, didn't pause. They registered the fallen one, adjusted their spacing to fill the gap, and continued climbing. Diane fired again. Another dropped, and another. Each shot precise, each impact terminal, and each kill observed and incorporated by the survivors and rise. The others didn't scatter, didn't flinch, didn't pause. They registered the fallen one, adjusted their spacing to fill the gap, and continued climbing. Diane fired again. Another dropped, and another. Each shot precise, each impact terminal, and each kill observed and incorporated by the survivors without interrupting their advance. They were learning the pattern of the threat direction, frequency, lethality, and adjusting their approach to minimize exposure while maintaining progress. They're flanking, Brannon said sharply. Right side, 3 of them breaking wide. He was without interrupting their advance. They were learning the pattern of the threat direction, frequency, lethality, and adjusting their approach to minimize exposure while maintaining progress. They're flanking, Brannon said sharply. Right side, 3 of them breaking wide. He was right. A subset had split from the main group and were angling around a rock formation that would bring them to our position from an unprotected direction. Coordinated tactics, applied intelligence, adaptive response to active resistance. This was what the darkness had grown. What the mine had been incubating below us while was right. A subset had split from the main group and were angling around a rock formation that would bring them to our position from an unprotected direction. Coordinated tactics, applied intelligence, adaptive response to active resistance. This was what the darkness had grown. What the mine had been incubating below us while we slept above. The infection hadn't destroyed cognition, it had restructured it, simplified it. We slept above. The infection hadn't destroyed cognition, it had restructured it, simplified it, stripped away the noise of human consciousness, and left something focused, communal, and evolving. "We have to move," I said. "We hold," Brannon countered. "Two more." Stripped away the noise of human consciousness, and left something focused, communal, and evolving. "We have to move," I said. "We hold," Brannon countered. 2 more minutes." "We don't have 2 minutes." And then, from the western slope below, 4 minutes. "We don't have 2 minutes." And then, from the western slope below, a sound that cut through everything. A signal flare, arcing red and brilliant against the gray sky. Military standard, deliberately launched, answering. "That's her," a sound that cut through everything. A signal flare, arcing red and brilliant against the gray sky. Military standard, deliberately launched, answering. "That's her," Brannon said, and his voice broke with something I hadn't heard from him before. Brannon said, and his voice broke with something I hadn't heard from him before. Relief so profound, it cracked through his professional armor like water through stone. "Diane, covering fire. Everyone else, move west. Now, down the ridge toward that." Relief so profound, it cracked through his professional armor like water through stone. "Diane, covering fire. Everyone else, move west. Now, down the ridge toward that flare. Go." We went. Diane fired 3 more rounds in rapid succession. That flare. Go. We went. Diane fired 3 more rounds in rapid succession, suppressing rather than targeting, and then she was running with us, the rifle bouncing against her back. 5 people plunging down the western face of the ridge toward a suppressing rather than targeting, and then she was running with us, the rifle bouncing against her back. 5 people plunging down the western face of the ridge toward a red light fading in the sky like a promise already beginning to expire. We found her at the drainage. Red light fading in the sky like a promise already beginning to expire. We found her at the drainage. Corporal Reeves, very much alive, bleeding from multiple lacerations, but moving with the compact efficiency of someone who decided dying wasn't on today's schedule. Corporal Reeves, very much alive, bleeding from multiple lacerations, but moving with the compact efficiency of someone who decided dying wasn't on today's schedule. She had a military radio on her hip, a service pistol in her hand, and eyes that went wide when they found Brannon among our group. She had a military radio on her hip, a service pistol in her hand, and eyes that went wide when they found Brannon among our group. "Sergeant," she said. Just that. Just his rank and the weight of everything between that moment and the one where she'd told him to run. "Corporal." His voice matched hers. "Sergeant," she said. Just that. Just his rank and the weight of everything between that moment and the one where she'd told him to run. "Corporal." His voice matched hers, single word, infinite content. Then the professional mask reassembled. Single word, infinite content. Then the professional mask reassembled. "I have intermittent comms with Echo," she said. "Their perimeter held. They're running extraction operations along the highway corridor. I've been trying to reach them." "I have intermittent comms with Echo," she said. Their perimeter held. They're running extraction operations along the highway corridor. I've been trying to reach the range for 2 days. Can you reach them from here? She lifted the radio and keyed the transmit button. Their range for 2 days. Can you reach them from here? She lifted the radio and keyed the transmit button. Static then. Echo command, this is Recon 2 actual. How copy? Nothing. Then distant, broken, but unmistakable a human voice. Recon 2, echo command. We read you weak. Static then. Echo command, this is Recon 2 actual. How copy? Nothing. Then distant, broken, but unmistakable a human voice. Recon 2, echo command. We read you weak. Send traffic. Echo command, I have Recon 2 Alpha plus 4 civilian survivors. Send traffic. Echo command, I have Recon 2 Alpha plus 4 civilian survivors. Request extraction. Grid follows. She read coordinates from a GPS device on her wrist. The voice on the other end acknowledged, promised a response window, and the request extraction. Grid follows. She read coordinates from a GPS device on her wrist. The voice on the other end acknowledged, promised a response window, and then dissolved back into static. But it was enough. Contact was made. We existed in someone's operational picture. We were no longer ghosts. And dissolved back into static. But it was enough. Contact was made. We existed in someone's operational picture. We were no longer ghosts. Extraction window is 6 hours, Reeves said. They'll meet us at the highway junction, 8 clicks northeast. That's the closest they can bring vehicles without entering. Extraction window is 6 hours, Reeves said. They'll meet us at the highway junction, 8 clicks northeast. That's the closest they can bring vehicles without entering unsecured territory. 8 kilometers. Through infected territory. Bring unsecured territory. 8 kilometers. Through infected territory. With fading daylight and a group that included 3 untrained civilians, one of whom was running on his last reserves. The math was not kind. But it was math with fading daylight and a group that included 3 untrained civilians, one of whom was running on his last reserves. The math was not kind. But it was math with a solution at the end. Not a mind filling with intelligent dead. Not a sealed chamber where the ceiling was time and the floor was predators. The solution at the end. Not a mind filling with intelligent dead. Not a sealed chamber where the ceiling was time and the floor was predators. A destination. An endpoint. People with resources and capability and the institutional will to bring us inside their perimeter. We move now, Brannon said. Double time. A destination. An endpoint. People with resources and capability and the institutional will to bring us inside their perimeter. We move now, Brannon said. Double time where possible. Reeves on point, me on rear. Civilians in the center. Nobody objected. Nobody hesitated. Time where possible. Reeves on point, me on rear. Civilians in the center. Nobody objected. Nobody hesitated. We moved. The 8 kilometers took 4 hours. 4 hours of forest and road and exposed terrain that required sprinting. 4 hours of infected, spotted at distances. We moved. The 8 kilometers took 4 hours. 4 hours of forest and road and exposed terrain that required sprinting. 4 hours of infected, spotted at distances and avoided by route changes. 4 hours of Marcus being physically supported by Rachel and me when his legs threatened to fail, and avoided by route changes. 4 hours of Marcus being physically supported by Rachel and me when his legs threatened to fail, his weight between us like a shared burden that made the 3 of us stronger rather than weaker. Diane walked with the rifle ready, and twice she fired at infected, his weight between us like a shared burden that made the 3 of us stronger rather than weaker. Diane walked with the rifle ready. And twice she fired at infected. They came too close, single shots, precise. The muscle memory of Brandon's training saving us in moments where hesitation would have been fatal. They came too close, single shots, precise. The muscle memory of Brandon's training saving us in moments where hesitation would have been fatal. We reached the highway junction at dusk. The armored vehicles were waiting, 2 Humvees and a personnel carrier. Soldiers in full gear establishing a defensive perimeter around the rendezvous point. A lieutenant stepped forward as we emerged from the tree line, counted 5 civilians and 2 soldiers, and nodded as if we were a delivered package arriving on schedule. "Inside," he said. "Now, we have a 30-minute window before we pull back." We loaded into the personnel. We reached the highway junction at dusk. The armored vehicles were waiting, 2 Humvees and a personnel carrier. Soldiers in full gear establishing a defensive perimeter around the rendezvous point. A lieutenant stepped forward as we emerged from the tree line, counted 5 civilians and 2 soldiers, and nodded as if we were a delivered package arriving on schedule. "Inside," he said. "Now, we have a 30-minute window before we pull back." We loaded into the personnel carrier. The rear door closed and the engine engaged, and the vehicle began moving. I sat on a metal bench between Rachel and Marcus, and felt the vibration of road beneath wheels rather than the vibration of something breathing below. Diane was crying. Silently, without expression change. Tears tracking the carrier. The rear door closed and the engine engaged, and the vehicle began moving. I sat on a metal bench between Rachel and Marcus, looking down her face while her hands remained steady on the rifle she hadn't released. Marcus had his eyes closed and felt the vibration of road beneath wheels rather than the vibration of something breathing below. Diane was crying. Silently, without expression change. Tears tracked moving. I sat on a metal bench between Rachel and Marcus, looking down her face while her hands remained steady on the rifle she hadn't released. Marcus had his eyes closed, breathing with the deliberate depth of someone reminding their body that oxygen was available. Rachel's hand found mine in the dim interior and squeezed once, not in fear, and felt the vibration of road beneath wheels rather than the vibration of something breathing below. Diane was crying. Silently, without expression change. Tears tracking down her face while her hands remained steady on the rifle she hadn't released. Marcus had his eyes closed, breathing with the deliberate depth of someone reminding their body that oxygen was available. Rachel's hand found mine in the dim interior and squeezed once, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. We were out. We were alive. But in acknowledgement. We were out. We were alive. We were leaving the mountain and whatever was growing inside it to the darkness it had chosen. Brandon sat across from us, beside Reeves, their shoulders touching. We were leaving the mountain and whatever was growing inside it to the darkness it had chosen. Brandon sat across from us, beside Reeves, their shoulders touching. He met my eyes and nodded once. Nothing else. Nothing else was needed. The vehicle carried us northeast. Behind us, the mountain receded into gathering dark, keeping its secrets, keeping its dead. Forward Base Echo was a parking lot surrounded by wire and weaponry. Through my eyes and nodded once. Nothing else. Nothing else was needed. The vehicle carried us northeast. Behind us, the mountain receded into gathering dark, keeping its secrets, keeping its dead. Forward Base Echo was a parking lot surrounded by wire and weaponry. 300 people surviving by structure and firepower and the collective decision to keep functioning. They gave us food, water, medical evaluation, and bunks in a gymnasium that smelled of disinfectant and human density. I slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke, Rachel was beside me, already awake, watching 300 people surviving by structure and firepower and the collective decision to keep functioning. They gave us food, water, medical evaluation, and bunks in a gymnasium that smelled of disinfectant and human density. I slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke, Rachel was beside me, already awake, watching the gymnasium ceiling with the expression of someone cataloging what they'd become. "We made it," she said. "We made it." But the mind wasn't finished with me. It lives in the space between sleep and waking, those stone corridors, that absolute dark, and Holloway's hemorrhagic eyes examining me through a gap in the barricade, with something that wasn't hunger. It was recognition. It was assessment. It was the beginning of whatever they were becoming. And we had left them to become it without witness. I dream of vibrations through the gymnasium ceiling with the expression of someone cataloging what they'd become. "We made it," she said. Through stone, of patterns repeated and answered, of intelligence assembling itself in the dark, patient and strange, beneath a mountain that will keep its secrets until the world comes looking. I hope the world isn't ready to look just yet. I know I'm not. We made it. But the mind wasn't finished with me. It lives in the space between sleep and waking, those stone corridors, that absolute dark, and Holloway's hemorrhagic eyes examining me through a gap in the barricade, with something that wasn't hunger. It was recognition. It was assessment. It was the beginning of whatever they were becoming, and we had left them to become it without witness. I dream of vibrations through stone, of patterns repeated and answered, of intelligence assembling itself in the dark, patient and strange, beneath a mountain that will keep its secrets until the world comes looking. I hope the world isn't ready to look just yet. I know I'm not.